At WWII, on the morning of March 12, 1943, the Atlantic Ocean heaved beneath the keel of HMS Clyde, a flower-class corvette churning through the grey-black swells east of Newfoundland. The wind screamed like a banshee through the rigging, carrying with it the salt sting of spray and the acrid tang of diesel exhaust that clung to every metal surface, every woolen uniform, every exposed pore. Above, the sky was a bruised tapestry of cloud, low, thick, and roiling, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. Below decks, the air was thick with the smell of damp wool, unwashed bodies, and the faint metallic musk of gun oil. The ship groaned, a living thing straining against the sea's relentless grip, its rivets shuddering with each swell, its bulkheads sighing under pressure. In the cramped, dimly lit gunnery control station tucked just aft of the bridge, Petty Officer Tommy Lawson wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, smearing grease across his temple. His fingers trembled, not from fear but from exhaustion. He'd been on watch for 17 hours straight, eyes glued to the MiG-2 bar and Stroud rangefinder, its brass eyepieces cold against his skin, its dials stiff with salt corrosion. Around him, the crew moved in practiced silence, their boots thudding on steel grating, their voices low murmurs lost beneath the thrum of the engines and the howl of the wind outside. No one spoke much at this hour, not when the U-boats were hunting, not when the convoy, the precious lumbering line of merchantmen carrying food, fuel, and munitions to Britain, was vulnerable, exposed, drifting like lambs through a wolf-infested night. Tommy wasn't an officer, he wasn't even a specialist. He was a gunner's mate, third class, assigned to the forward 4-inch gun mount after being pulled from the galley where he had spent 2 years peeling potatoes and scrubbing pots. He'd never fired a naval gun in anger before last month. He didn't know the difference between a Bofors and a pom-pom beyond what he'd read in the manual during downtime. He had no formal training in ballistics, no schooling in fire control, no interest in tactics or strategy. What he had was eyes that saw patterns others missed, ears that caught whispers the noise drowned out, and a stubborn, quiet mind that refused to accept things as they were, simply because that's how we'd always done it. He adjusted the focus ring on the rangefinder again, squinting through the twin lenses at the dark silhouette of the freighter Empire spearhead 300 yards off the port bow. The ship's outline was barely visible against the storm-lit water, its mast lights flickering weakly through the rain. Tommy tracked its movement, noting the slight roll, the yaw, the way its stern dipped deeper into the troughs than its bow. He'd been doing this for weeks now, watching the ships, measuring distances, recording angles, scribbling notes in a battered notebook tucked inside his oilskin jacket. No one asked why. No one cared. He was just the guy who kept the guns aimed. That was his job. That was all he was supposed to be. But he noticed things, like how the German bombers, Junkers Ju-88s mostly, always came in from the same direction. Low, fast, skimming the waves like predatory birds, their engines screaming just above the sound of the wind. They'd approach from the starboard quarter, usually around 03 Zoo, when the moon was hidden and the convoy's escort ships were most vulnerable. They'd drop their bombs in a tight pattern, aiming for the center of the formation, then peel away sharply, banking hard to avoid the flak. It was predictable, almost ritualistic. And yet, despite the predictability, the anti-aircraft fire was useless. Tommy had watched it happen over and over. The guns would open up, thunderous bursts of 4-inch shells roaring into the sky, tracer rounds streaking upward like angry fireflies. But the planes always slipped through. Sometimes they'd take hits, sometimes they'd jink away, but rarely did they go down. The official reports called it ineffective fire. The officers blamed poor coordination, bad visibility, faulty fuse settings. Tommy knew better. He'd seen it firsthand during the attack on the HMS Larkspur 2 nights ago. He'd been on the secondary mount, feeding shells into the breach while the gun captain shouted corrections. He remembered the exact moment. 0342, the sky split by lightning, the Ju-88 diving steeply, its shadow falling across the deck like a shroud. The gun crew had fired a full salvo, 6 shells timed to explode at the predicted point of impact. But the plane didn't hit the burst. It flew right through it, untouched, dropping its bombs harmlessly into the sea before banking sharply and vanishing into the clouds. And Tommy had noticed something else. The pilot hadn't been flying straight. He'd been weaving, not wildly, not erratically, but in a smooth, rhythmic pattern, a slight left-right-left oscillation, almost imperceptible unless you were watching closely. It was subtle, barely a deviation from course, but enough to throw off the calculations. The fire control teams were using fixed lead angles, assuming the target would maintain a steady heading. But the Germans weren't flying steady. They were adjusting, subtly, constantly, exploiting the gap between prediction and reality. It was a flaw, a tiny, invisible crack in the system. And Tommy was the only one who saw it. He didn't say anything at first. He was just a gunner's mate. Who would listen? The officers were busy with charts and radios and orders from higher command. The gun captains were focused on timing, elevation, fuse settings. No one had time for a lowly sailor's observations, so Tommy kept his mouth shut, wrote his notes, and watched. Then, on the night of March 8th, during another attack, he saw it again. Same pattern, same evasion, same useless fire, and this time he couldn't stay silent. He waited until the raid was over, until the last bomber had vanished into the storm, until the convoy had resumed its slow, steady crawl toward England. Then, as the crew began cleaning the guns and reloading ammunition, Tommy approached Lieutenant Commander Evans, the ship's gunnery officer. A lean, sharp-eyed man with a permanent scowl and a clipboard always in hand. "Sir," Tommy said, keeping his voice low, respectful, "I think I've figured out why we're missing." Evans didn't look up from his logbook. Figured out what? The bombers, they're not flying straight. They're weaving, slightly, just enough to throw off the lead. Evans finally glanced at him, one eyebrow raised. "Weaving? You mean evasive maneuvers?" "No, sir, not full evasive, just a pattern. Left, right, left, like they're correcting for wind or something, but it's consistent. Every time." Evans closed his logbook with a snap. "You were telling me the Germans are deliberately flying in a sine wave to dodge our fire?" "I'm telling you they're doing it, sir, and we're not accounting for it." Evans stared at him for a long moment, then let out a dry chuckle. "Lawson, you've been on watch too long. Get some sleep. We'll discuss this after you've had a hot meal and a decent rest." Tommy opened his mouth to protest, but Evans was already turning away, barking orders to the gun crews. The conversation was over. That night, lying in his bunk, Tommy stared at the ceiling, listening to the creak of the ship, the drip of condensation from the overhead pipes, the muffled snores of his shipmates. He thought about the Ju-88s, about the way they moved, about the math he'd scribbled in his notebook. He wasn't wrong. He knew he wasn't, but no one would believe him, not without proof, so he decided to prove it. The next day, during a lull in the convoy ES Progress, when the escort ships were circling the merchantman in a protective ring scanning for U-boats, he slipped away from his post and made his way to the forward gun mount. The 4-inch gun was unmanned, its breech open, its barrel pointing skyward like a silent sentinel. Tommy climbed up the ladder, ignoring the curious glances from nearby sailors, and began adjusting the sights. He didn't touch the firing mechanism. He wasn't going to shoot, he was going to simulate. He took out his notebook and began calculating. If the bomber was flying at 250 knots, descending at 15 degrees, with a lateral weave amplitude of roughly 5 meters every 3 seconds, what would the required lead angle be? He factored in wind resistance, shell velocity, time of flight. He worked it out on paper, then transferred the numbers to the gun's elevation and traverse dials. He set the sights not for a straight-line target, but for a moving, weaving one, he didn't tell anyone. He didn't ask permission. He just did it. When the gun captain, Chief Petty Officer Davies, found him there an hour later, he nearly exploded. "What in God's name are you doing, Lawson?" Davies barked, his face red with fury. "You don't mess with the sights without authorization. You could throw off the entire fire control system." "I'm testing a theory, sir," Tommy said calmly, not looking up from his adjustments. "A theory? What theory? You're a gunner's mate, not a mathematician. I think I know why we're missing the bombers, sir. And I think I can fix it," Davies scoffed. "Fix it with what? A slide rule and a prayer?" Tommy didn't answer. He just finished his adjustments, stepped back, and handed Davies the notebook. "Here, look at the calculations. Try it just once. Next time we're under attack." Davies flipped through the pages, his expression shifting from anger to skepticism to reluctant curiosity. The numbers were precise. The logic was sound. But it was still insane. No one had ever tried to account for lateral weave in anti-aircraft fire control. It was too complex, too variable, too human. "We'll see," Davies muttered, closing the notebook and handing it back. "But if you screw this up, Lawson, you're on kitchen duty for the rest of the war." Tommy nodded. He didn't care about punishment. He cared about results. 2 nights later, at 03:19, the radar operator shouted, "Contact!" 2 bogies, starboard quarter, low altitude, closing fast. The ship erupted into action. Sirens wailed. Crewmen scrambled to stations. The gun crews loaded shells, checked fuses, aligned sights. Tommy stood beside Davies at the forward mount, his heart pounding, his hands steady. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Davies had set the gun to Tommy's calculations. All they could do now was wait. The first Ju-88 appeared out of the storm, its engines roaring, its wings gleaming wetly in the sporadic flashes of lightning. It dove, banking slightly to the left, then right, then left again, the familiar weave. The gun crews opened fire, their shells bursting in the sky ahead of the plane. But this time, the bursts weren't scattered. They were concentrated, timed, angled precisely to intercept the weaving target. The first shell exploded directly in front of the Ju-88's nose. The second hit its left wing. The third tore through the fuselage. The plane didn't just crash. It disintegrated. One moment it was there, screaming through the night. The next, it was gone, shattered into burning fragments that rained down onto the ocean like fiery confetti. The second bomber, seeing its wingmen destroyed, broke off abruptly, climbing steeply and vanishing into the clouds. No bombs dropped, no damage inflicted. Silence fell over the ship, broken only by the crackle of radio static and the distant roar of the engines. No one cheered. No one shouted. They just stared, stunned, at the empty sky where the plane had been. Davies turned to Tommy, his face pale, his voice barely a whisper. How did you know?" Tommy shrugged, wiping grease from his hands. "I watched." That's all, but Davies didn't believe him. No one did. Not really. They chalked it up to luck, to coincidence, to a fluke. The official report listed the kill as accurate fire under favorable conditions, no mention of weaving. No credit to Tommy. Just another successful engagement in the endless, grinding war against the skies. Tommy didn't argue. He didn't demand recognition. He just went back to his post, his notebook tucked safely in his pocket, his mind already racing ahead. He knew what he'd seen. He knew what he'd done. And he knew it wasn't over, because if one plane could be shot down with a little observation and a lot of math, then maybe, just maybe, they could bring down more. And if they could bring down more, they could save lives. Not just the lives of sailors on the Clyde, but the lives of thousands of men and women aboard the convoys, the lives of families waiting in London and Liverpool and Glasgow, the lives of a nation hanging by a thread. It was a small thing what he'd done, a tiny adjustment in a vast, impersonal machine of war. But sometimes the smallest things make the biggest difference. And Tommy Lawson, the gunner's mate who peered through brass lenses and scribbled equations in the dark, was about to change everything. The silence that followed the destruction of the Ju-88 didn't last. Within minutes, the Clyde's radio room crackled to life, with frantic transmissions from the convoy commodore. All escorts, report status. Repeat report status. Did you get it? Confirm kill. Lieutenant Commander Evans, still clutching his clipboard, stood at the bridge rail, binoculars trained on the spot where the bomber had vanished. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The sight of the burning wreckage sinking beneath the waves was confirmation enough. But the question remained, how? He turned to Davies, who was standing beside Tommy, his expression unreadable. What happened up there? Davies hesitated. He glanced at Tommy, then back at Evans. We adjusted the lead. Based on Lawson's calculations, Evans frowned. Calculations? What calculations? Tommy stepped forward, pulling the notebook from his pocket. Sir, I've been observing the bomber's flight patterns. They're not flying straight. They're weaving, slightly, consistently. Left, right, left every 3 seconds. It's subtle, but it's enough to throw off the standard lead angles. I calculated the necessary compensation. Davies set the gun to those parameters. That's why we hit it. Evans took the notebook, flipping through the pages with growing disbelief. The equations were precise. The logic was flawless, but it was still madness. No fire control system in the Royal Navy accounted for lateral weave. It was too unpredictable, too variable, too human. Yet here was a gunner's mate, with no formal training, no rank, no authority, claiming he'd cracked the code. You're telling me, Evans said slowly, that you've developed a new method of anti-aircraft fire control based on watching enemy pilots fly. Yes, sir. And you tested it without authorization. Yes, sir. Evans closed the notebook with a snap. You realize the penalty for unauthorized modification of naval ordnance is court-martial. Tommy didn't flinch. Yes, sir. Evans studied him for a long moment, then let out a low whistle. You're either a genius or an idiot, Lawson. I haven't decided which yet. He turned to Davies. Get the other gun mounts reconfigured. Use Lawson's numbers. And if this works again, I'm sending a report to Naval Command. Tommy didn't react. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just nodded, tucked the notebook back into his pocket, and went back to his station. The next few days passed in a blur of routine and tension. The convoy pressed on, the escort ships circling like wary wolves, their guns ready, their crews alert. Tommy spent every waking hour refining his calculations, adjusting for wind speed, altitude, target velocity, even the slight variations in the bomber's weave patterns. He noticed things others didn't, how the Ju-88s tended to favor a tighter weave when flying at lower altitudes, how the Heinkel He-111s preferred a wider arc, how the Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condors, those lumbering giants of the sky, barely weaved at all, making them easier targets but harder to hit due to their size and speed. He shared his observations with Davies, who, despite his initial skepticism, had begun to trust Tommy's instincts. Together, they fine-tuned the gun settings, creating a rudimentary system of weave compensation that could be adjusted on the fly based on the type of aircraft approaching. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't foolproof, but it was better than nothing. And then, on the night of March 16th, the test came. At 2:48, the radar operator's voice crackled over the intercom. Contact! 4 bogies, port beam, low altitude, closing fast. The ship erupted into action. Sirens wailed. Crewmen scrambled to stations. The gun crews loaded shells, checked fuses, aligned sights. Tommy stood beside Davies at the forward mount, his heart pounding, his hands steady. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Davies had set the gun to Tommy's latest calculations. All they could do now was wait. The first bomber appeared out of the storm, its engines roaring, its wings gleaming wetly in the sporadic flashes of lightning. It dove, banking slightly to the left, then right, then left again, the familiar weave. The gun crews opened fire, their shells bursting in the sky ahead of the plane. But this time the bursts weren't scattered. They were concentrated, timed, angled precisely to intercept the weaving target. The first shell exploded directly in front of the bomber's nose. The second hit its left wing. The third tore through the fuselage. The plane didn't just crash. It disintegrated. One moment it was there, screaming through the night. The next, it was gone, shattered into burning fragments that rained down onto the ocean like fiery confetti. The second bomber, seeing its wingman destroyed, broke off abruptly, climbing steeply and vanishing into the clouds. No bombs dropped, no damage inflicted. The third and fourth bombers, however, didn't retreat. They pressed on, flying in tight formation, their engines screaming, their bombs primed. They were desperate. They were reckless. And they were doomed. The Clyde's guns roared, their shells stitching the sky with deadly precision. The third bomber took a direct hit, its tail shearing off in a shower of sparks. The fourth tried to evade, banking sharply to the right, but Tommy had anticipated it. He'd factored in the increased weave amplitude that came with panic. The gun crews adjusted, firing a salvo that caught the plane mid-turn. It exploded in a fireball that lit up the night sky like a second coming. Silence fell over the ship, broken only by the crackle of radio static and the distant roar of the engines. No one cheered, no one shouted. They just stared, stunned, at the empty sky where the planes had been. Evans appeared on the bridge, his face pale, his voice barely a whisper. 4 kills. In under 2 minutes. How did you do it? Tommy shrugged, wiping grease from his hands. I watched. That's all. But Evans didn't believe him. No one did. Not really. They chalked it up to luck, to coincidence, to a fluke. The official report listed the kills as accurate fire under favorable conditions. No mention of weaving. No credit to Tommy. Just another successful engagement in the endless grinding war against the skies. Tommy didn't argue. He didn't demand recognition. He just went back to his post, his notebook tucked safely in his pocket, his mind already racing ahead. He knew what he'd seen. He knew what he'd done. And he knew it wasn't over. Because if 4 planes could be shot down with a little observation and a lot of math, then maybe, just maybe, they could bring down more, and if they could bring down more, they could save lives. Not just the lives of sailors on the Clyde, but the lives of thousands of men and women aboard the convoys, the lives of families waiting in London and Liverpool and Glasgow, the lives of a nation hanging by a thread. It was a small thing what he'd done, a tiny adjustment in a vast, impersonal machine of war. But sometimes the smallest things make the biggest difference, and Tommy Lawson, the gunner's mate who peered through brass lenses and scribbled equations in the dark, was about to change everything. The aftermath of the 4-kill engagement was not celebration, but confusion. The Clyde's crew moved through the next 24 hours in a haze of disbelief, their routines mechanical, their conversations hushed. Men who had spent months dodging bombs and cursing their luck now whispered about Lawson's magic math, as if it were some arcane incantation rather than trigonometry and keen observation. Davies, though outwardly stoic, began quietly incorporating Tommy's weave compensation tables into the daily gun drills, running simulations with dummy targets hoisted from the davits, adjusting elevation and traverse dials according to Tommy's handwritten charts. The results were undeniable. The simulated bombers were hit with alarming consistency, yet no one dared call it science. Not yet Evans, however, was no longer content to dismiss Tommy as a lucky fool. He spent the better part of the next day locked in the wardroom with the ship's wireless operator, composing a coded dispatch to the Admiralty's anti-aircraft directorate at Portsmouth. He framed it cautiously. No grand claims, no revolutionary pronouncements. Just a request for guidance. Unusual success observed in recent engagements. Suspect enemy aircraft employing consistent lateral maneuver. Request evaluation of proposed compensatory fire control adjustments. He attached Tommy's notebook, carefully photocopied by the ship's signalman using the emergency duplicator, and sealed it in a waterproof pouch with a priority flag. The response, when it came 3 days later via encrypted teleprinter, was terse, bureaucratic, and deeply skeptical. From A.A. Dyer, Portsmouth to HMS Clyde. Subject: Fire control adjustments. Your report noted. Unauthorized modifications to naval ordnance are prohibited under regulation. 7.31. Any further experimentation without approval will be treated as a breach of discipline. Request you cease all non-standard procedures immediately. Admiralty staff. Evans read it aloud in the wardroom, his voice flat, his expression unreadable. Davies exhaled sharply. Tommy said nothing. He simply took the printout, folded it neatly, and slipped it into his pocket. That night, as the Clyde ploughed through the icy swells of the North Atlantic, Tommy sat alone in the gunnery control station, the only light coming from the dim glow of the rangefinder's calibration dial. He didn't write in his notebook. He didn't adjust dials or calculate trajectories. He just sat, staring at the blank page, listening to the rhythm of the ship, the groan of the hull, the hum of the generators, the distant murmur of the crew below decks. He thought about the Admiralty's response, about the word unauthorized, about the phrase breach of discipline. He thought about the 4 bombers that had fallen from the sky, their crews vaporized in seconds, their missions aborted, their bombs never reaching the convoys. He thought about the men and women aboard those merchant ships, fathers, mothers, children, whose lives had been saved because he had dared to look closer, to question the accepted wisdom, to challenge the system. And he thought about the cost, because if the Admiralty wouldn't listen, if they wouldn't adapt, if they insisted on clinging to outdated procedures, then more bombers would slip through, more ships would be sunk, more lives would be lost. All because a handful of bureaucrats in Portsmouth were too afraid to admit they might be wrong. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he began to plan. By dawn, he had a new idea, one that didn't require permission, didn't violate regulations, didn't need approval. He would create a training aid, something simple, something visual, something that could be demonstrated without firing a single live round. He gathered scraps of wood from the carpenter's locker, lengths of copper wire from the electrician's stores, and a spool of twine from the sailmaker's shack. He spent the next 2 days constructing a crude but functional model, a miniature aircraft suspended on wires, rigged to oscillate left and right in a controlled, rhythmic pattern. He mounted it on a wooden base with a rotating platform, allowing it to simulate different approach angles and speeds. He labeled it Target Movement Simulator, experimental use only, and placed it on the mess deck table where it would be impossible to ignore. When Davies saw it the next morning, he nearly choked on his tea. "What in God's name is that?" "Training aid, sir," Tommy said, adjusting the wire tension. "Demonstrates the lateral weave pattern. Helps the gun crews visualize the target's movement." Davies stared at it, then at Tommy, then back at the model. "You built this? Out of scrap?" "Yes, sir. And you're calling it experimental use only?" "Yes, sir." Davies let out a low chuckle. "You're a clever bastard, Lawson. I'll give you that." He didn't stop Tommy. He didn't confiscate the model. He didn't report it to Evans. Instead, he gathered the gun crews during their lunch break and ordered them to observe the simulator. "Watch it," he said, cranking the handle to set the miniature aircraft into motion. "See how it moves? That's what you're shooting at. That's why your shots miss. Now adjust your aim accordingly." The effect was immediate. The gunners, who had previously relied on instinct and rote procedure, began to understand the mechanics of the weave. They started anticipating the movement, adjusting their lead angles instinctively without needing to consult Tommy's notebooks. They began to talk about the Lawson weave, not as a joke, but as a real observable phenomenon. Evans, walking past the mess deck later that afternoon, paused to watch. He didn't comment. He didn't order the model removed. He just stood there, arms crossed, watching the miniature aircraft sway back and forth, its tiny wings catching the light, its movement hypnotic, undeniable. When he finally turned away, his expression was unreadable. But Tommy saw the shift in his posture, the slight tilt of his head, the narrowing of his eyes. He was thinking. He was considering. He was, perhaps, beginning to believe. The real test came on the evening of March 24th, during a routine convoy exercise off the coast of Iceland. The Clyde was acting as the flagship for a mock attack scenario, with 2 destroyers playing the role of enemy bombers, their decks rigged with smoke generators and dummy bomb racks. The goal was to simulate a coordinated strike. testing the convoy's defensive capabilities under realistic conditions. Tommy, stationed at the forward gun mount, watched as the destroyers approached, their wakes cutting white lines across the darkening water. He didn't need his notebook. He didn't need calculations. He had memorized the patterns, internalized the rhythms, learned to read the movement of the ships as if they were living creatures. He signaled to Davies, who nodded and relayed the adjustments to the other gun crews. When the destroyers reached optimal range, the Clyde's guns opened fire, not with the usual chaotic barrage, but with disciplined, synchronized salvos, each shell timed and angled to intercept the simulated weave. The first bomber took a direct hit, its smoke generator erupting in a plume of white powder. The second veered sharply, trying to evade, but Tommy had anticipated the maneuver. The gun crews adjusted, firing a second salvo that caught the destroyer broadside, triggering a cascade of simulated explosions. The exercise ended with both bombers disabled, their crews signaling surrender. The convoy commodore, watching from the bridge of the flagship, turned to Evans with a look of astonishment. "How did you do that?" "I've never seen such accurate fire in a drill." Evans didn't answer immediately. He looked at Tommy, who was already reloading the guns, his face impassive, his hands moving with mechanical precision. Then slowly, Evans turned back to the Commodore. "We adapted," he said simply. "We listened." That night, Evans summoned Tommy to his cabin. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of tobacco and old paper. Evans sat behind his desk, his hands clasped, his expression unreadable. Tommy stood at attention, his notebook tucked under his arm, his heart pounding. "Sit down, Lawson," Evans said. Gesturing to the chair opposite him, Tommy sat. Evans leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "You've caused quite a stir." "Yes, sir." "Do you realize what you've done? You've essentially rewritten the rules of anti-aircraft fire control, without authorization, without training, without permission." "Yes, sir." "And yet, it works." "Yes, sir." Evans sighed, running a hand through his hair. "The Admiralty won't like this. They'll see it as insubordination, as defiance, as a threat to established doctrine." Tommy didn't respond. He just waited. Evans studied him for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair. "But here's the thing, Lawson. In war, doctrine doesn't win battles. Adaptation does. Innovation does. People like you, people who see what others miss, who dare to challenge the status quo, that's what wins wars." He paused, then added, "So here's what we're going to do. You're going to write up a formal report. Detailed, precise, everything you've observed, everything you've calculated, everything you've tested. I'll submit it to Portsmouth. And if they still refuse to listen..." He trailed off, then smiled, a rare, genuine smile. "Well, let's just say I know a few people in the Air Ministry who might be interested." Tommy didn't smile. He didn't thank him. He just nodded, stood, and left the cabin, his notebook heavy in his hand, because he knew what came next. The real battle wasn't against the bombers, it was against the bureaucracy. And Tommy Lawson, the gunner's mate who peered through brass lenses and scribbled equations in the dark, was about to face his greatest challenge yet. The report Tommy drafted was not a plea. It was not a petition. It was not a humble suggestion wrapped in deferential language. It was a manifesto, precise, clinical, unyielding in its logic, written in the stark, unadorned prose of a man who had spent too many nights watching death skim the waves, and too many mornings counting the cost of failure. He titled it simply, "Observations on Enemy Aircraft Lateral Maneuver and its Impact on Anti-Aircraft Fire Control Efficiency." He appended 47 pages of data, graphs plotting weave amplitude against target velocity, tables correlating altitude with oscillation frequency, annotated sketches of dive profiles, and most damning of all, side-by-side comparisons of standard fire control results versus his own compensated methodology. The conclusion was inescapable. The current system was obsolete. The enemy had evolved. The Navy had not. Evans submitted it to Portsmouth on March 28, 1943, with a cover letter that read, in part, "This is not a request for approval. This is evidence. Ignore it at your peril. The response, when it arrived 10 days later, was not a reply. It was a summons from a dear. Portsmouth to HMS Clyde, subject. Personnel interview Petty Officer Thomas Lawson is hereby ordered to report to Naval Headquarters, Portsmouth, for debriefing and evaluation. Transport arranged. Departure. No later than April 5th. Failure to comply will result in disciplinary action. Admiralty staff. There was no salutation, no courtesy, no acknowledgement of the report's contents. Just an order, a threat, a warning. Tommy read it in the gunnery control station, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. Davies stood beside him, his jaw clenched, his knuckles white. "They're going to bury you, lad," he muttered. "They'll call you a troublemaker, a rogue, maybe even a traitor." Tommy didn't respond. He just folded the paper, tucked it into his pocket, and went back to his duties. The journey to Portsmouth was a study in silence. The Clyde docked at the naval base on April 4th, her decks scrubbed clean, her guns polished, her crew standing at rigid attention as Tommy disembarked. His sea bag slung over his shoulder, his notebook tucked securely inside his tunic. He was met by a pair of stiff-backed lieutenants in crisp uniforms, their expressions unreadable, their voices clipped. "Petty Officer Lawson, follow us." They led him through the labyrinthine corridors of the Admiralty building, past offices filled with men in pinstripes and ink-stained fingers, past maps pinned to walls and teleprinters clattering with urgent messages. The air smelled of pipe smoke, leather, and the faint metallic tang of bureaucracy. Tommy didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. He just walked, his boots echoing on the marble floors. His mind racing ahead, he was ushered into a conference room on the 3rd floor, its windows overlooking the harbour where destroyers and cruisers bobbed at anchor like toys. Seated at the long oak table were 3 men, a rear admiral with a monocle and a voice like gravel, a captain with a pen perpetually poised over a notepad, and a civilian scientist in a tweed jacket. His glasses perched precariously on his nose. They didn't rise as Tommy entered. They didn't greet him. They just stared, their expressions ranging from disdain to outright hostility. "Petty Officer Lawson," the Admiral said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Sit." Tommy sat. The Admiral leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "You've caused quite a stir, haven't you? Unauthorized modifications, unsanctioned experiments, defiance of established doctrine. Tell me, Lawson, what makes you think you know better than the men who have spent decades perfecting naval gunnery?" Tommy didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He met the Admiral's gaze squarely. "I don't think I know better, sir. I think I've observed something others have missed," the scientist snorted. "Observed? You mean guessed. You're a gunner's mate, not a physicist. You don't understand ballistics. You don't understand aerodynamics. You don't understand the complexities of fire control systems." "I understand what I've seen, sir," Tommy said calmly. "I've seen bombers weave. I've seen our shells miss. I've calculated the compensation. I've tested it. It works," the captain scribbled furiously on his notepad. "And how, pray tell, did you test it? Did you fire live rounds at friendly aircraft? Did you endanger the convoy?" "No, sir. I used simulations, models, training aids, and real engagements. 4 confirmed kills in 2 separate attacks." The Admiral's monocle slipped slightly. 4 kills in a single engagement? That's statistically improbable. "It's not statistics, sir. It's observation," the scientist scoffed. "Observation without measurement is anecdote. Without peer review, it's meaningless." Tommy didn't argue. He simply opened his notebook, flipped to a specific page, and slid it across the table. "Here, the data, the calculations, the timestamps, the coordinates, the weather conditions, the target types, everything." The Admiral picked up the notebook, his expression unreadable. He flipped through the pages slowly, his lips moving silently as he read. The captain leaned over, peering at the graphs. The scientist adjusted his glasses, his brow furrowed in concentration. For 5 minutes, the only sound in the room was the scratch of the captain's pen and the distant cry of gulls outside the window. Then the Admiral closed the notebook and looked at Tommy. "You're either a fraud or a genius." Tommy didn't respond. The Admiral sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Very well. We'll test your method, but not here, not in a classroom, out in the field, under real conditions. If it works, we'll consider adopting it. If it fails..." He let the threat hang in the air. Tommy nodded. "When? Tomorrow. You'll be assigned to HMS Vimy, a V-class destroyer operating in the western approaches. She's scheduled for convoy escort duty. You'll have one engagement, one chance. Fail, and you'll be court-martialed. Succeed and..." He trailed off, then added, "Well, we'll see." Tommy didn't ask for clarification. He didn't beg for mercy. He just stood, saluted, and left the room. The next morning he boarded the Vimy, a sleek, grey-hulled destroyer with a reputation for speed and firepower. Her captain, Commander Whitmore, was a grizzled veteran with a reputation for discipline and a disdain for innovation. He greeted Tommy with a curt nod and a single sentence. "Don't screw this up, Lawson. My ship's record is impeccable. I intend to keep it that way." Tommy didn't respond. He just took his place at the forward gun mount, his notebook tucked securely in his pocket, his mind already racing ahead. The convoy they escorted was smaller than usual, just 6 merchantmen, their decks crowded with nervous crewmen, their holds filled with vital supplies for the war effort. The Vimy circled them like a hawk, her guns trained skyward, her crew alert, her radar scanning the horizon. Tommy spent the day observing, calculating, adjusting. He didn't speak to the gun crews. He didn't explain his methods. He just worked, his hands moving with mechanical precision, his eyes scanning the sky for the first sign of trouble. It came at 03:12 on the morning of April 6, 1943. The radar operator's voice crackled over the intercom. "Contact! 3 bogies, starboard beam, low altitude, closing fast." The ship erupted into action. Sirens wailed. Crewmen scrambled to stations. The gun crews loaded shells, checked fuses, aligned sights. Tommy stood beside the gun captain, his heart pounding, his hands steady. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The gun captain had set the sights to Tommy's calculations. All they could do now was wait. The first bomber appeared out of the storm, its engines roaring, its wings gleaming wetly in the sporadic flashes of lightning. It dove, banking slightly to the left, then right, then left again, the familiar weave. The gun crews opened fire, their shells bursting in the sky ahead of the plane. But this time, the bursts weren't scattered. They were concentrated, timed, angled precisely to intercept the weaving target. The first shell exploded directly in front of the bomber's nose. The second hit its left wing. The third tore through the fuselage. The plane didn't just crash. It disintegrated. One moment it was there, screaming through the night. The next it was gone, shattered into burning fragments that rained down onto the ocean like fiery confetti. The second bomber, seeing its wingman destroyed, broke off abruptly, climbing steeply and vanishing into the clouds. No bombs dropped, no damage inflicted. The third bomber, however, didn't retreat. It pressed on, flying low, its engines screaming, its bombs primed. It was desperate. It was reckless. And it was doomed. The Vimy's guns roared, their shells stitching the sky with deadly precision. The bomber took a direct hit, its tail shearing off in a shower of sparks. It spiraled downward, crashing into the sea with a thunderous splash. Silence fell over the ship, broken only by the crackle of radio static and the distant roar of the engines. No one cheered. No one shouted. They just stared, stunned, at the empty sky where the planes had been. Whitmore appeared on the bridge, his face pale, his voice barely a whisper. 3 kills in under 2 minutes. How did you do it? Tommy shrugged, wiping grease from his hands. I watched. That's all. Whitmore didn't believe him. No one did. Not really. They chalked it up to luck, to coincidence, to a fluke. The official report listed the kills as accurate fire under favorable conditions, no mention of weaving. No credit to Tommy, just another successful engagement in the endless grinding war against the skies. But this time, Tommy didn't care because he knew what he'd seen. He knew what he'd done, and he knew it wasn't over. Because if 3 planes could be shot down with a little observation and a lot of math, then maybe, just maybe, they could bring down more. And if they could bring down more, They could save lives, not just the lives of sailors on the Vimy, but the lives of thousands of men and women aboard the convoys, the lives of families waiting in London and Liverpool and Glasgow, the lives of a nation hanging by a thread. It was a small thing, what he'd done, a tiny adjustment in a vast, impersonal machine of war. But sometimes the smallest things make the biggest difference, and Tommy Lawson, the gunner's mate who peered through brass lenses and scribbled equations in the dark, was about to change everything. The silence that followed the destruction of the third bomber on the Vimy was not the stunned quiet of disbelief, but the heavy, expectant hush of inevitability. Commander Whitmore stood on the bridge, his hands gripping the railing so tightly his knuckles whitened, his gaze fixed on the spot where the Ju-88 had vanished beneath the waves. He didn't speak. He didn't order a report. He didn't even turn to look at Tommy, who stood below on the gun deck, his face streaked with grease and salt spray, his notebook clutched to his chest like a shield. He just stared, his mind racing, his world tilting on its axis, because what he had just witnessed wasn't luck. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't a fluke. It was science. It was mathematics. It was observation elevated to art. And it had been performed by a gunner's mate with no rank, no formal training, no authority. Just eyes that saw what others missed and a stubborn refusal to accept the impossible. The Vimy returned to Portsmouth on April 7, 1943, her deck still smelling of cordite and salt, her crew moving with the subdued energy of men who had glimpsed something extraordinary. Tommy was not greeted with fanfare. He was not hailed as a hero. He was not even acknowledged. He was simply directed to report to the Admiralty building, where the same 3 men awaited him in the same oak-paneled conference room, their expressions unchanged, their demeanor as rigid as ever. But something had shifted. The Admiral no longer wore his monocle. The captain's notepad lay closed on the table. The scientist had removed his glasses, polishing them slowly with a silk handkerchief. They didn't speak as Tommy entered. They just watched him, their eyes sharp, their minds calculating. "Petty Officer Lawson," the Admiral said finally, his voice devoid of its earlier condescension. "You've given us—" Pause. Tommy didn't respond. He didn't sit. He just stood at attention, his notebook held loosely at his side. The scientist cleared his throat. "Your data is compelling. The correlation between lateral weave and fire control inefficiency is statistically significant. The predictive models you've developed are remarkably accurate. In fact," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "in fact, they may represent the most significant advancement in naval anti-aircraft doctrine since the introduction of the director system." The Admiral nodded slowly. "We've reviewed your report. We've consulted with the Air Ministry. We've run simulations. And we've concluded that your method works." Tommy didn't react. He didn't smile. He didn't ask for recognition. He just waited. The Admiral leaned forward, his voice low, serious. "But here's the problem, Lawson. Your method requires a level of precision, a degree of adaptability that our current fire control systems cannot accommodate. The directors are designed for fixed lead angles. They're calibrated for steady-state targets. They're not built to account for lateral oscillation." Tommy understood. He had known this from the beginning. The system wasn't broken. It was obsolete, and fixing it would require more than tweaks. It would require a revolution. "So what do you propose?" the Admiral asked. Tommy didn't hesitate. He opened his notebook, flipped to a specific page, and slid it across the table. "Here, the solution." The page contained a single diagram, a modified fire control director. Its dials and levers reconfigured to allow for real-time adjustment of lateral lead based on observed target movement. It was crude, hand-drawn, annotated with arrows and notes. But the concept was clear. Instead of relying on pre-calculated angles, the system would dynamically compensate for weave, using input from observers like himself to adjust the aim in real time. The scientist studied the diagram for a long moment, then let out a low whistle. "It's elegant, simple, brilliant even," the Admiral frowned. "Simple. It's a complete redesign of the fire control system. Not a redesign, Tommy corrected softly. An evolution. The Admiral looked at him, his expression unreadable. And who will build it? Who will train the crews? Who will implement it across the fleet? Tommy didn't answer. He just looked at the Admiral, then at the captain, then at the scientist. I will. There was a long silence. Then the Admiral let out a slow, deliberate breath. Very well. You'll be assigned to the Naval Ordnance Department at Portsmouth. You'll work with the engineers to develop a prototype. You'll train a team of observers, and you'll oversee the rollout to the fleet. Tommy nodded. When? Immediately. He didn't ask for leave. He didn't request time to prepare. He just turned, saluted, and left the room. The next 6 months were a blur of blueprints, prototypes, and relentless testing. Tommy worked alongside engineers, physicists, and gunnery experts, translating his observations into tangible, operational systems. He designed the Lawson compensator, a simple, robust device that could be retrofitted onto existing fire control directors, allowing gun crews to adjust for lateral weave with a twist of a dial. He trained a cadre of observers, teaching them to read the sky, to anticipate movement, to communicate adjustments with split-second precision. He oversaw the installation of the compensator on dozens of destroyers, corvettes, and frigates, watching as the kill rates soared. By October 1943, the results were undeniable. Ships equipped with the Lawson compensator reported a 300% increase in anti-aircraft effectiveness. The Luftwaffe, baffled by the sudden accuracy of Allied fire, began avoiding convoy routes altogether. The western approaches, once a graveyard for merchant shipping, became a killing ground for German bombers. The Admiralty, forced to confront the evidence, quietly adopted the compensator as standard issue. Tommy's name appeared in technical manuals, his diagrams reproduced in training films, his methods taught to every gun crew in the fleet. Yet he sought no recognition. He declined medals. He refused promotions. He turned down interviews, speeches, and honors. He remained a petty officer, third class, his uniform unchanged, his quarters unchanged, his routine unchanged. He continued to observe, to calculate, to refine. He didn't care about fame. He didn't care about legacy. He cared about results because he knew what mattered, not the accolades, not the titles, not the praise, the lives saved, the ships protected, the war won. On December 15th, 1943, Tommy stood on the deck of the Clyde, now refitted with the Lawson compensator, watching as a convoy of 30 merchantmen sailed into the safety of Liverpool Harbour. The sky was clear, the sun warm on his face, the air sweet with the scent of coal smoke and salt. Behind him, the gun crews were cleaning their weapons, their movements relaxed, their faces calm. There was no tension, no fear, no desperation, just the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. Davies approached, his face lined with age and experience, his eyes tired but proud. They're calling it the Lawson method now, you know, officially. Tommy didn't respond. He just watched the ships, their hulls scarred but intact, their crews waving from the decks, their cargoes safe. Davies sighed, leaning against the railing. You changed everything, lad. You know that, don't you? Tommy shook his head. No, I just watched. That's all? Davies chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. Watching's not nothing, Tommy. Watching's everything. It's the difference between seeing the world as it is and seeing it as it could be. Tommy didn't answer. He just turned, walked to the gunnery control station, and opened his notebook. On the first page he wrote a single sentence, his handwriting neat, precise, unadorned. The sea doesn't care about rank. It doesn't care about protocol. It only cares about truth. And truth is found in the details, the ones everyone else ignores. He closed the notebook, tucked it into his pocket, and went back to his post. Because the war wasn't over, and there were still things to observe, still patterns to uncover, still lives to save. And Tommy Lawson, the gunner's mate who peered through brass lenses and scribbled equations in the dark, was still watching, always watching.